The Nexus Observatory hung in the void between three dying stars like a monument to intellectual arrogance, which was precisely what its architects had intended. For the past 6 millennia, this station had served as the galaxy's premier research facility for studying phenomena that polite mathematics preferred not to acknowledge existed. The observatory's crown jewel was the paradox engine, a device so fundamentally contrary to rational thought that even its creators weren't entirely sure how it worked. The engine occupied the station's central hub, a sphere of crystalline metal that hummed with the sort of energy that made nearby reality nervous. It had been designed by the collective genius of 47 different species' greatest mathematicians, philosophers, and individuals who had spent too much time thinking about things that probably shouldn't be thought about. The result was a machine capable of generating mathematical scenarios so impossible that attempting to solve them typically resulted in what the medical staff diplomatically termed acute cognitive restructuring. Chief Researcher Keth Morey regarded the engine with the fond pride of someone who had dedicated his existence to proving that the universe had limits, and those limits were absolute. Standing 12 feet tall when fully materialized in this dimension, with a consciousness that existed across 17 different planes of reality simultaneously, Keth Morey possessed an intellect that could contemplate concepts that would cause lesser minds to spontaneously develop protective amnesia. He had overseen the engine's trials for 800 years, during which time it had been attempted by 12,847 beings representing the finest intellectual achievements of 237 different species. The success rate stood at a mathematically elegant 0.023%, which Keth Morey considered proof that the universe possessed inherent boundaries that even the most advanced minds could not cross. The observatory attracted beings whose intelligence operated on scales that required specialized units of measurement. The crystalline Vorth, whose thought processes occurred at light speed, and who could perceive mathematical relationships across 11 dimensions. The gas-form Etherians, who existed as pure consciousness and could manipulate probability through focused meditation. The mechanical synthetics, whose artificial minds could process computational problems that would require organic brains the size of small moons. All impressive species with impressively consistent failure rates. Then the humans applied for an exchange program. The application had arrived through official diplomatic channels, which made it impossible to dismiss outright, though several department heads had made valiant attempts. Earth's contribution to galactic mathematics was generally considered to be somewhere between quaint and actively harmful, and their request to send a researcher to the observatory had been met with a sort of polite bewilderment typically reserved for particularly slow children who had asked to perform surgery. Nevertheless, the Galaxy Accords required member species to accommodate reasonable educational exchanges, and someone in the administrative department had apparently decided that allowing a human to observe advanced mathematical research fell within the definition of reasonable, possibly after consuming substances that impaired their judgment. Maya Chen arrived on the observatory's monthly supply transport, looking exactly like what the station's residents expected a primitive species mathematician to look like. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, possessed the unremarkable appearance that evolution had apparently decided was adequate for her species, and carried herself with the sort of quiet confidence that made advanced beings wonder if they were missing something important. The other researchers greeted her arrival with mixtures of curiosity, condescension, and carefully suppressed concern that she might accidentally break something expensive. Dr. Vexethlin, a Vorth whose crystalline form reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, had volunteered to serve as Maya's supervisor, primarily because his colleagues had convinced him it would be amusing. Human mathematics, he explained during Maya's orientation, his voice creating harmonic frequencies that translated roughly as barely contained intellectual superiority, operates on principles that our ancestors abandoned during their primitive phases of development. We find it charmingly simplistic. Maya nodded politely and asked if she could see some examples of advanced galactic mathematics. Dr. Vexethlin proceeded to demonstrate equations that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, calculations that required manipulating concepts that had no names in languages limited to linear time, and proofs that the very act of understanding them changed the nature of reality in subtle but measurable ways. Fascinating, Maya said when he finished. We call that topology back home. The silence that followed suggested that either the translation systems had malfunctioned or Dr. Vexethlin was reconsidering his assumptions about human intellectual development. Maya's first weeks at the observatory passed in a blur of condescending lectures, patronizing explanations, and carefully orchestrated demonstrations of how inferior her species' mathematical understanding was compared to the advanced civilizations surrounding her. She attended seminars on hyperdimensional calculus, where the speakers used concepts her people allegedly couldn't comprehend. She observed experiments involving mathematical principles that supposedly transcended human cognitive capabilities. Through it all, she maintained the sort of polite interest that her colleagues interpreted as appropriate recognition of her intellectual limitations, when in fact she was taking detailed mental notes about how unnecessarily complicated everyone was making relatively straightforward problems. The turning point came when chief researcher Keith Morey decided to use Maya as a demonstration subject for the paradox engine. The idea had emerged during a faculty meeting, where several researchers suggested that showing a human the engine's impossibility would provide valuable data about how primitive minds processed concepts beyond their comprehension. It would be educational, Dr. Vexethlin had argued, his harmonic voice suggesting that educational meant something quite different in his language than it did in Maya's. And harmless, added Dr. Synthesis 7, a synthetic whose artificial consciousness existed as pure mathematical logic. Human cognition lacks the complexity necessary to achieve the sort of cognitive damage our trials typically produce. Keith Morey found the proposal intriguing. The engine had been designed to challenge the greatest minds in the galaxy, but no one had ever tested it against a mind that was, by galactic standards, barely above the threshold of true sentience. The data collected could provide valuable insights into the lower boundaries of consciousness, and Maya's inevitable failure would serve as an excellent teaching example about the absolute nature of mathematical impossibility. Very well, he decided. We shall demonstrate the engine's principles using our human colleague as a subject. It will be a valuable lesson for everyone involved. The announcement of Maya's upcoming attempt spread through the observatory with the efficiency of a particularly interesting piece of gossip. Within hours, researchers from across 17 different departments had found reasons to visit the engine chamber, most claiming they were conducting routine observations while actually hoping to witness what promised to be either a historically significant moment or an entertainingly brief disaster. The morning of the demonstration arrived with the sort of crystalline clarity that made the void between stars look almost welcoming. Maya Chen appeared at the engine chamber, wearing standard observatory research attire and an expression of calm interest that several observers found mildly offensive. She had taken the time to review the available literature on the engine's theoretical foundations, which most beings considered either admirable preparation or evidence of complete misunderstanding of what she was about to face. Chief researcher Quent Morey conducted the preliminary briefing with the thoroughness of someone who wanted to ensure that all observers would understand exactly what they were about to witness. The paradox engine, he explained, his multidimensional consciousness projecting concepts directly into the minds of everyone present, generates mathematical scenarios that exist beyond the boundaries of rational solution. It is not merely difficult mathematics, it is impossible mathematics. Mathematics that contradicts its own foundations while remaining internally consistent. Maya listened with the sort of attentive focus that suggested she was genuinely interested in understanding the technical specifications. The engine operates in 3 phases, Quent Morey continued. The logic cascade subjects candidates to recursive paradoxes that trap consciousness in infinite loops of self-contradictory reasoning. Survival of this phase requires not just mathematical brilliance, but the ability to maintain cognitive function while processing concepts that violate the fundamental principles of rational thought. That sounds challenging, Maya observed. Challenging is an inadequate term, Mori replied. The second phase, the probability storm, subjects candidates to scenarios where mathematical certainty becomes fluid. Numbers change meaning while being used, equations solve themselves incorrectly, and the basic principles of logic become suggestions rather than laws. And the third phase? The reality inversion. Mathematics and reality exchange positions. What is mathematically true becomes physically real, while physical reality becomes subject to mathematical manipulation. Candidates must solve problems that exist in a state where the very concept of solution has no meaning. Mori's consciousness rippled with satisfaction at the elegant impossibility of his creation. The engine adapts to each species' cognitive capabilities, ensuring that every challenge operates at precisely the level required to produce complete intellectual failure. It is, quite literally, impossible to succeed. Impossible, Maya repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting mathematical concept. It is not a concept, Mori corrected. It is an absolute, a fundamental boundary that defines the limits of what consciousness can achieve. I see. When do we begin? The researchers exchanged glances that conveyed mixtures of anticipation and professional concern. Dr. Vexethlin activated his recording systems to document what he was certain would become a textbook example of cognitive limitations. Dr. Synthesis 7 began calculating the probability matrices for various failure scenarios. Several other observers placed informal wagers on how quickly Maya would succumb to acute cognitive restructuring. Maya approached the engine's interface, a complex array of crystalline surfaces that responded to thought rather than touch. The mathematics it would present existed in forms that transcended traditional sensory input, requiring candidates to process information through direct consciousness interface. At the threshold of the first phase, she paused and reached up to gather her unremarkable brown hair into a simple ponytail. Securing it with what appeared to be a standard elastic band she had produced from somewhere in her research attire. The gesture took perhaps 4 seconds and involved no ceremony, no ritual preparation, no dramatic declarations of intent. She smiled. Not the desperate expression of someone trying to convince themselves they were adequately prepared, or the manic grin of someone who had lost touch with reality. Just a simple, genuine smile that somehow conveyed that she was looking forward to the intellectual challenge ahead. Then she activated the interface and stepped into the logic cascade like she was settling down to work on an interesting puzzle. The first phase of the engine was a masterwork of recursive impossibility, designed to trap consciousness in logical loops that fed back on themselves until rational thought collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The cascade presented paradoxes that had no solutions, questions that invalidated themselves by being asked, and mathematical proofs that their own conclusions were false. For Maya Chen, it presented a scenario where she had to prove that proof itself was impossible. Using logic to demonstrate that logic couldn't demonstrate anything, and mathematical reasoning to show that mathematical reasoning was fundamentally invalid. She examined the paradox with the sort of methodical attention she might give to any interesting mathematical problem, noted that it was based on the assumption that mathematical systems had to be internally consistent to be useful, and proceeded to work with inconsistency as a fundamental principle rather than a flaw. Well, she murmured to herself, if consistency is impossible, then inconsistency becomes the consistent approach. The cascade, designed to trap minds that insisted on rational solutions to irrational problems, found itself dealing with a consciousness that seemed perfectly comfortable treating contradiction as a starting point rather than an obstacle. Maya worked her way through recursive paradoxes by accepting that recursion didn't require resolution, solved self-contradictory equations by letting them contradict themselves while still extracting useful information, and proved that proof was impossible by constructing a proof that remained valid despite invalidating itself. The logic cascade attempted to escalate its assault, presenting even more elaborate contradictions, deeper recursive loops, more fundamental challenges to the nature of rational thought. Maya Chen treated each new impossibility as an interesting variation on themes she was already exploring, approaching mathematical paradoxes with the sort of practical flexibility that comes from growing up in a species that had learned to work around the fact that reality rarely cooperated with theoretical models. She emerged from the logic cascade in 43 minutes, having left behind a trail of resolved paradoxes that technically shouldn't have been resolvable. In the observation chamber, the assembled researchers stared at their monitoring equipment with the sort of stunned silence that typically preceded either scientific breakthroughs or complete mental breakdown. The readings showed that all systems had functioned normally, that the Cascade had deployed its full arsenal of impossible mathematics, and that Maya Chen had somehow found ways to work with impossibility as if it were merely inconvenient rather than absolute. System malfunction, Dr. Vexethlin suggested, his crystalline form flickering with patterns that indicated severe cognitive stress. All systems show optimal operation, Dr. Synthesis 7 reported, his artificial consciousness struggling to process data that contradicted his fundamental programming about the nature of mathematical impossibility. The second phase activated automatically. The probability storm was designed to subject candidates to mathematics, where certainty became probabilistic, where numbers could exist in multiple states simultaneously, and where equations could solve themselves in ways that violated their own parameters. Maya entered the storm and found herself facing mathematical problems where the numbers changed while she was working with them, where the same equation could be simultaneously true and false, and where probability curves existed in 17 different configurations at once. She approached these challenges with a sort of cheerful adaptability that her colleagues back on Earth would have recognized as distinctly human stubbornness, disguised as intellectual flexibility. When numbers refused to remain stable, she worked with ranges instead of absolutes. When equations contradicted themselves, she let them maintain their contradictions while still extracting meaningful results. When probability became non-deterministic, she found ways to work with uncertainty as a mathematical tool rather than an obstacle. The storm escalated its assault, introducing scenarios where mathematical reality became completely fluid, where the basic principles of arithmetic became suggestions, and where logical relationships existed in states of continuous flux. Maya Chen discovered that humans had been dealing with exactly these sorts of problems for millennia, except they called them economics, weather prediction, and attempting to understand why their technology worked when the theoretical models said it shouldn't. She spent 2 hours in the probability storm, emerged looking slightly disheveled but distinctly satisfied, and immediately asked about the third phase. Perhaps, Chief Researcher Quet Mori suggested, his multidimensional consciousness rippling with concepts that roughly translated as desperate confusion, you would like to rest before proceeding to the final phase. Thank you, but I'd like to finish while I have momentum. The reality inversion represented the engine's ultimate challenge, a phase that existed beyond conventional description, because describing it would require language that didn't collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. In the inversion, mathematics became physically real while reality became subject to mathematical manipulation. Candidates had to solve problems that existed in states where the concepts of problem and solution had exchanged definitions with existence and impossibility. Maya Chen entered the inversion and found herself in a space where thinking about mathematical relationships made them physically manifest, where abstract concepts gained tangible properties, and where the distinction between theoretical and actual had become a matter of perspective rather than fundamental truth. She approached this challenge with the same methodical persistence she had demonstrated throughout the previous phases, treating each new impossibility as an interesting variation on the theme of working with systems that didn't behave the way they were supposed to. When mathematical concepts became physically real, she interacted with them as physical objects that happened to follow mathematical rules. When reality became subject to mathematical manipulation, she manipulated it using mathematical principles while remembering that the mathematics itself was now part of reality rather than separate from it. The inversion attempted to overwhelm her with scenarios that operated on principles that shouldn't exist, in environments that couldn't be real, using logic that was simultaneously valid and completely meaningless. Maya Chen discovered that the key was not to solve the problems, but to recognize that in a space where mathematics and reality had exchanged positions, the concept of solving had become something entirely different from what it had been when she started. She worked with impossibility as a collaborative partner rather than an obstacle to overcome, treated contradictions as features of the system rather than bugs to be eliminated, and found ways to achieve meaningful results in a context where meaningful and results were continuously redefining themselves. 3 hours later, she emerged from the reality inversion, looking tired, somewhat confused about which dimension she was currently occupying, and remarkably pleased with herself. The observation chamber had fallen into the sort of silence that usually indicated either profound scientific revelation or complete breakdown of institutional understanding. Chief researcher Quint Mori stared at his displays, which showed irrefutable evidence that a human female had just completed a mathematical trial designed to be absolutely impossible. "Congratulations," he said finally, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested his consciousness was having difficulty maintaining cohesion across all 17 dimensions simultaneously. "Thank you. That was really interesting." Interesting. The paradox engine, the observatory's ultimate mathematical challenge, the device designed to prove the absolute boundaries of what consciousness could achieve, had been interesting. "How?" Dr. Vexethlon asked, his crystalline form flickering with patterns that indicated complete conceptual overload. "Oh, you mean my approach?" Maya settled into a nearby chair, apparently unaware that she was causing an existential crisis for some of the galaxy's greatest minds. "Well, I think the issue was that everyone was trying to solve problems that were designed not to be solved. But that's not actually what mathematics is for." She paused, considering how to explain concepts that suddenly seemed much more complex than she had realized. Mathematics isn't about finding absolute answers to absolute questions. It's about finding useful ways to work with systems that don't behave the way you expect them to. Back home, we deal with impossible mathematics all the time. We just call them things like quantum mechanics and economic modeling and trying to figure out why the internet works. The silence that followed was the sort that usually preceded either scientific revolution or complete abandonment of previous assumptions about the nature of reality. The engine was designed around the assumption that mathematical impossibility represents a fundamental boundary. Maya continued, "But impossibility is just a description of our current understanding, not a description of what's actually possible. If you design a system to be impossible to solve, and then you discover someone has solved it, the logical conclusion isn't that the system was broken. It's that your definition of impossible was inadequate." Dr. Synthesis, Seven's artificial consciousness, spent several seconds processing this concept before responding. "You are suggesting that impossibility is a relative rather than absolute condition. I'm suggesting that impossibility is a challenge to find better approaches, not a statement about fundamental limits." Chief researcher Quint Mori's multidimensional consciousness rippled with what might have been the beginning of a paradigm shift or possibly an impending cognitive breakdown. His life's work had been based on the principle that the universe contained absolute boundaries that even the most advanced minds could not cross. Maya Chen had just demonstrated that those boundaries were more like strongly worded suggestions that could be politely ignored if you approached them from the right direction. Word of Maya's success spread through the observatory, with the speed and destructive potential of a runaway chain reaction. Within hours, every researcher on the station knew that their fundamental understanding of mathematical impossibility had been proven inadequate by someone whose species had only recently figured out how to travel faster than light. The administrative staff immediately began emergency meetings to discuss what they termed recalibration of foundational assumptions, and what everyone else understood to be panic-driven attempts to figure out what other impossible things might actually be possible. Various departments sent urgent communications to their respective species governments, warning that humans appeared to possess mathematical capabilities that their previous assessments had completely failed to identify. The fact that these capabilities seemed to consist primarily of treating impossibility as a starting point rather than a conclusion was somehow more unsettling than if Maya had demonstrated supernatural powers. Maya, for her part, seemed genuinely surprised by the reaction her achievement had generated. She had simply wanted to understand how the observatory's most sophisticated device worked, and she had discovered that it worked exactly as designed. The fact that it had been designed around assumptions about the nature of impossibility that turned out to be incorrect struck her as an interesting problem rather than a fundamental crisis. "Will you be publishing your methodology?" Dr. Vexethlin asked as the department heads gathered to discuss the implications of her success. "Oh, there's no methodology," Maya replied. "I just worked with what the system was doing instead of fighting against it. It's basic problem solving. You adapt your approach until you find something that works." "But the mathematical principles you used," Dr. Synthesis 7 pressed. "The theoretical frameworks that allowed you to process impossible scenarios." "I didn't use any special frameworks. I just remembered that mathematics is a tool for understanding systems, not a set of absolute rules that systems have to follow. When the system behaves in ways that don't match your mathematical models, you don't declare the system impossible. You develop better models." The gathered researchers exchanged looks that conveyed the sort of profound uncertainty that usually preceded either scientific revolution or complete abandonment of academic careers. "So you're saying," Chief Researcher Quent Mori said slowly, "that impossibility is simply a description of inadequate methodology?" "Well, sometimes. Other times impossibility is just a description of something that hasn't been done yet. And sometimes it's a description of something that can't be done using current approaches, but might be doable using approaches that haven't been invented yet." She paused, considering the faces around her, and realized that she might not be explaining this in the most helpful way. "Look back on Earth, we have a saying. Impossible just means we haven't figured out how to do it yet. It's not that we think everything is possible. It's that we think impossible is often a temporary condition rather than a permanent one." The observatory's researchers spent the following weeks attempting to redesign the paradox engine to incorporate what they termed human-resistant mathematics. The process involved questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of mathematical reality that had remained unchallenged for millennia. Maya offered to help with the redesign, pointing out that if they really wanted to create something impossible, they should probably involve someone who had experience working with impossibility on a regular basis. "After all," she said with a sort of cheerful helpfulness that was causing nightmares for researchers across 17 different species, "if you want to make something impossible, you should probably ask someone who's good at making impossible things work." The irony was not lost on Chief Researcher Quint Mori that in order to restore impossibility to his engine, he would need to collaborate with the being who had proved that his understanding of impossibility was fundamentally flawed. But then again, he reflected, as he watched Maya Chen explain basic human problem-solving techniques to some of the galaxy's most advanced minds, perhaps impossibility had always been more of a perspective than an absolute. After all, impossible was just another word for, "we haven't figured out how to do it yet." And humans, apparently, were exceptionally good at figuring things out.